All right, so now we've just completed the speaking portion of the town hall, and we're going to go over to the Q&A portion of the town hall. So if any of the Q&A panelists or the board have any questions, go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll ask you for you in the chat. Really, no questions? Oh, there's Gayle. Cool. All right, Gayle, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. This was so very, very interesting. I appreciate all the speakers and OR and I forget the name, badass teachers group that co-sponsored this. So my question, some of the things that really resonated, I think all of it resonated, but in particular, the aspect that I think Jennifer and Jack talked about in terms of how our schools are preparing students for workforce preparation rather than to learn and to appreciate and to tap into their curiosity and creativity and all those wonderful things that education should be. We're preparing them for, or they're trying to get us to prepare them for the workplace. I'm a Richmond City Council member, a former mayor of Richmond, and we as a city council gave money to our schools to help schools from closing, and but I also have a little bit of experience as a public education teacher, not a whole lot, but I found the high stake testing and the lack of funding and all that to be just really hard to deal with because it really wasn't helping the students. So, and I do see this heavy competition and workforce preparation as being a real problem. And the question is, it seems like so many of the aspects of our society intersect, and they intersect by way of hierarchical relations, like work and production. It's mirrored in our schools because there's hierarchies between administrators and teachers and students and other students. And that corresponds to the boss-worker relationship. And indeed, we're preparing students to play a role in that hierarchy. They become alienated just as workers become alienated. So I've heard so many solutions which are really good, like more funding, stopping the charter school expansion, stopping high stakes teaching, more desegregation, teacher support, etc. One thing that I wanted to ask about that I think is an overlap as well in terms of this hierarchy and in terms of another area of our society, and that's the military. Could someone talk about military recruiting in our schools and how we can stop that? I know there's been organizing. I've been involved a little bit in Richmond with trying to stop that. And where is it at? I know it's an opt-out. Parents have to opt out of having their kids' names and information go to the military so they can have that information. Is there any advancement to stop that, that opt-out and just eliminate that information giving to the military from the schools? And also, has there been any advancement of stopping military recruiters to come onto school campuses in general?
Yeah, so I guess that would be for Anthony and Jennifer. Any of you had any thoughts?
I wasn't I can, that was actually the first campaign I ever did as a high school student in Oakland, was to fight against the school district from giving our contact info to military recruiters. And so in a real sense, there are multiple things that school boards can do, and it's really a school board choice. So the school board does not have to provide contact information to the military. They can take a vote and decide whether they want to do that or not. it's very hard to limit military recruiters' access to the schools, because there are families that want that, like they want access to colleges. But you can make sure there's not things like teachers giving extra credit to attend sessions with military recruiters. But these decisions have to come from a school board, and the school board can set any policy that they want around that. And that should be the overarching policy. And I would just say, especially now that I have to be concerned as a school board director instead of just what I think, there still are large segments of our community that see the military as an opportunity for a future also. And so I think when we're looking at this, we should be really explicit that if we're looking at eliminating something, that we are creating a better option to go with it. Malcolm talked about the clean glass of water. I really believe in that. And so if we're looking at doing something with military recruiters, then let's make sure that we have much better internships, career technical training, and college access to balance it out then. But a school board can make any of those decisions.
Thank you, Mike.
Let's see here. Anthony or Jennifer, did you have any thoughts, or we can go on to the next question? Okay, Lamar, I guess you're the next one up with your hand raised, so go ahead and ask your question.
Well, I was paying attention. I believe it was Ben, so I can go after Ben. I don't want to get in line.
Yeah, sorry. On my screen, it was showing you. Okay, yeah, go ahead, Ben.
Okay, Lamar, I'm honored to tee you up, I guess. But an honor to be here with you and see you here. Mike Hudson, good to see you, buddy. Congratulations. You pulled it off. Really proud of you. And hi, Gayle, wonderful. And so this has really been an amazing panel. I wasn't quite sure what to expect, right? And honestly, I want to say that the speakers have definitely reframed my personal conception of public education. Definitely, because my mother is a school teacher and has been most of my life, and she has a reading system. She sells to school districts and helps Black kids get out of the special ed track into prison. I myself was pulled out of public schools when they were very racist to me, so I went to Black Panther school when I was a kid, and then was homeschooled for many years. So I have a multi-leveled sort of conception and opinion of the education system, and it's not without my own personal critiques. But I see it in a new light now, I want to tell you. And I'm optimistic for articulating a new vision for it. And as the author said, we need to re-articulate the purpose of education, right? To create a cohesive society. And I'm thinking about how we recently had this, right now in this country, we're at loggerheads with the quote unquote right and the quote unquote left at loggerheads, right? Where, Civil War talk is in the media all the time. It seems like now more than ever, we need that vision of public schools as a place to come together and learn to live with each other. Now, my question is related to the Biden infrastructure funds that were mentioned. I don't know enough about it, but I'm wondering if the capital improvements to government buildings, could that be used to channel resources into these schools that are so depleted and so distressingly bankrupt that it makes parents want to have choice, right? And if we can tie job creation, economic development to these new cells of opportunity represented by these community centers, what schools are, right? These schools, it seems like we could have something and build from there. That's just my thoughts. But does anyone know about the direction of the funding for the public dollars?
So that the infrastructure money is absolutely you can absolutely be used for capital improvements. And one of the things that's been so interesting is that the Biden folks are pouring an immense amount of money into public education, but also into really like a kind of poverty relief effort that we haven't seen in generations. That they're doing something that we have not done, or we had really sort of taken off the table, which is that the idea that you can make people less poor by giving them money directly. And so it's not just that we have this opportunity to improve the schools, but we have the opportunity to really like make people's lives better. And the thing that concerns me is that when it comes to schools, the Biden folks, they don't really seem to have an explanation as to the why behind any of this. So, for example, in their budget that they released at the end of the week, they announced, we're going to give even more money to Title I schools, which will include most of the schools in Oakland. But they can't really say like, well, why are we doing this, right? So far, it's still hung up on the Obama era explanations. Well, it's going to improve test scores. Well, it's gonna, this is preparation for workforce. So it's funny because Ben, as you were talking, even though I had my camera off, I was nodding away. Because even though Jack and I wrote this book that is actually quite grim, I feel like you do. That we are in this moment where, because this kind of treaty that Jack was describing has broken down, and even though there are, if you look at a community like Oakland, where there are all these deep-pocketed forces that have a very particular vision, I think there's enough space between what people on the ground want, parents, students, and what's being offered by the people with all the money, that we can build some alliances and really like demand something bigger, right? Because at the end of the day, there, as Mike was saying, we might not have the answer for what transformational change looks like, but there's nobody in Oakland who says that my vision of a great school is one that raises my son or daughter's math and English test scores. That's all I care about. That's too narrow. And so we have an opportunity to kind of blow that up. Anthony, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, but that's all I have.
Well, thank you for that. That was amazing comment, and I'd love to stay in touch and and do my part to help articulate this future. Thank you.
Yeah, Mike, I'd like to also hear your thoughts on that too, if possible.
No, I agree. I think with these being one-time dollars, it gives us the opportunity to think. It's not even outside of the box that they had us in. Because these are dollars that are outside of our normal budget process. So this is our time to think about some of these things. Like, for example, in the infrastructure bill, there's language specifically about taking care of lead in the water and lead in pipes. In Oakland, we're definitely going to make a play as a school district to use that for our schools. And so I think there's these opportunities. I would love for us to see if there's even some regional opportunities, because we also have a new city council in Oakland now that might be more willing to have. So I think these are the things that we need to figure out and look into. So let me, as a blanket statement, there are very few strings attached to these dollars right now. And the strings might appear in the future, and there's going to be probably still more money coming, but especially with a little budget creativity, there are very few strings, and these are almost unrestricted dollars.
And what I would add, and I think both Mike and Jennifer have kind of addressed this partly, but up until this budget, this new funding, the discretionary funding that's come along has been coming from these philanthropies for a long time. And that, when you have a district like Oakland that's starved for funding, you can come along with $1 million or $2 million, which really isn't a very large amount of money relative to Oakland's annual budget, and you can steer the whole ship with that small amount of discretionary funding. So, you know, with the arrival of a lot more of this discretionary funding, it sort of demands involvement. It demands a really heightened level of involvement, of community involvement, so that it isn't wasted on more test preparation and learning loss compensation programs in the summer or something like that. You know, we need to really elevate the solutions that are, you know, that are community driven, that are developed by local educators and local community leaders. And that's where it's really important that we have groups like Journey for Justice on the ground, capable of articulating what those programs should look like, what community, you know, and going back to the, you know, it's great that the Black Panther schools were mentioned, you know, going back to the roots of liberation education, and seeing how we can bring that up from the grassroots as sort of an alternative vision to all of this workforce preparation mindset, test score mindset programming.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. All right, Lamar, now you're up.
Hola. Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you for having little old me all the way from Antioch. So my question, you know, as some of you talked, I was very, very impressed. But I was some of what was being said reminded me of Naomi Klein's book, the Shock Doctrine, and it was fascinating because, of course, as I'm hearing Mike talk about what happened in Oakland, you know, my first job out of graduate school was as a substitute teacher in Washington, D.C. under Michelle Reed. And so I literally watched the devastation and the exploitation of, to your point, you know, places that were once called Chocolate City. Literally, this has happened everywhere. New Orleans has been taken over by charter school. Washington, D.C. has been taken over by charter schools. Oakland is being taken over by charter schools, and so on and so on. And literally cities that used to be majority Black cities. And so, but as I thought about the premise or the theory that Naomi Klein puts out in her book, is something happened that would have allowed the exploitation of this, that created a vacuum, or there was a vacuum that wasn't being filled. And the disparities that are current today, whether it's here in Antioch in our public schools with Black children, in Oakland, I'm sure, and everywhere else, didn't happen as a result of charter schools, didn't happen as a result of vouchers and privatization, have always existed. And I am by no stretch of the imagination any charter school advocate, by no stretch. I've been a strong public school supporter. But that vacuum has created the environment. Our lack or our inability to deal with those disparities has created these moments. And we're going to continue to be in this cycle. You know, all this money that comes from the federal government, we start to talk about redesigning this, that, and the third. If we don't really come to grips with how we really deal with the fact, here in Antioch, we have 2 zip codes. One is the wealthiest in East Contra Costa County, second to Discovery Bay, and one is the poorest, one of the poorest in our county. The wealthiest is where the majority of Black people live. And yet the outcomes, the academic outcomes in our public schools in this wealthy zip code are horrendous, are absolutely horrendous. So we got to deal with those structural inequities, those challenges. And so I'm curious to get, our panelists' take on how we deal with some of these realities.
I think that one of the things that the pandemic really did was force people to acknowledge that those kinds of disparities not only exist, but that they have a profound effect on what happens in school. Suddenly we could all see what out of school looked like. And the whole, I mean, I'm amazed that you worked in DC with Michelle Rhee, because she was really kind of the poster person for the idea that you didn't need to do anything about the disparities outside of schools because they could be remedied inside the schools. That if you just got the teachers who were willing to work hard enough and believe hard enough, and that was going to require a lot of change, right? Like, they couldn't have unions anymore because the unions just protected the bad teachers, and you needed to get away, you needed to cut through all of this red tape. And so, like, that vision appealed to a lot of people, and it appealed to a lot of people who have a lot of people with power and money, right? Because it means, like, if we really could lift kids up out of poverty without having to make any kind of structural change, wouldn't that be so great? If you didn't have to pay higher taxes, if you got to stay in your nice zip code, but no one ever had to give anything up. So now I think we're at this point where though the Michelle Rhees are really gone, right? Like, one of my sort of, one of the points that I always think about is that her group, Students First, no longer exists. It was taken over by another group that now advocates for private school vouchers, right? Like, what a telling example of the sort of ed reform trajectory. But so I think this is what Jack and I were getting at when we talked about the Biden administration as being kind of stuck in the Rip Van Winkle education reform period, that they're still acting as though, even though outside of education, they're acknowledging that we can't help families in poverty unless we do something directly about the fact that they're in poverty. But when it comes to education, they're still talking about schools as though that somehow they're gonna, that if we just raise student test scores and hold teachers accountable for student test scores, that's gonna be the thing that does it. I feel like there's an opportunity that's really opened up here, but we have exactly the challenge that Lamar was pointing to, which is that these vast disparities existed long before things like school privatization. That in many cases in these communities, the privatization has been kind of imposed on top of the disparities. And so you have these bitter battles playing out where inevitably it's the teachers unions or people who are perceived as the status quo they almost sound as though they're saying that the disparities are okay, we just don't like your particular remedy, right? And so I think, like, what's inspiring about this and hearing Lamar's story and Ben's story is that there's exhaustion with the set of solutions, while everyone's still acknowledging that, like, if we don't figure out how to deal with these disparities, like, we're, like, this is an explosive situation. We have to come up with something. I don't have the answer. That's why I'm so glad to be among brilliant people like yourselves. And I'll mute myself now.
I think just the other thing to throw, and thank you I always forget at the start to say, and I need to be better about it, our schools have never done as well as they should or they could. And that's just a given, especially in our communities. But we also have to recognize that over time, our schools are doing better. And the other trap with this is a lot of these statements about our schools not doing well or not performing are based on standardized testing. And our students are always going to fail racist tests. That's how they're designed. And in Oakland, as a district, we have roughly a third of our students, or 35% of our students, testing proficient across the whole district. For African American students, it barely reaches double digits. And so it is two things together. It is our schools aren't serving us well enough, but we also have to have the right tools to evaluate our schools and make those decisions going forward. And so for me personally, what I try to pick the third way. I really believe that if we set up a system where the community feels like they are empowered to make decisions for their school site, we can go around a lot of these things, and the community knows what works, what we need to do. It is a question of having that system in place and then making sure that we are fully resourcing those decisions that the community is making. But I know that most people, given a choice of everything being equal, would want to walk to their neighborhood public school. It's our job to make those conditions equal so they will make those choices.
And if I could just build on that a bit, I think part of the challenge is to create another way of looking at learning, because it's not enough just to say standardized tests are racist, which they are. We have to create a competing and compelling vision of how do we, I don't want to use the word measure, but how do we recognize learning? How do we celebrate learning in our schools? How do we, and there are schools that have done really great work with portfolios and students kind of developing projects that really represent their learning. There's a New York Performance Consortium schools that have been opting out of the Regents exams for quite a while now, that have really shown how you can do this with a faculty that comes together and really works with the students closely to chart their own paths to some extent in terms of how are they going to conceptualize their education. And I think that's something we might think about when we look at what some of this funding might be used for, but it's really challenging. I think part of the problem that with the paradigm that we're in is we've had this mindset that says schools should fix poverty, and then schools are blamed for not fixing poverty. And the premise was flawed to begin with. You don't fix poverty by getting kids to pass tests. Kids who are living in impoverished neighborhoods and impoverished communities have a fundamental problem of lack of identifying with the aspirations and the measurements, because they haven't succeeded with them. And to maintain a sense of self-identity, I think it's not necessarily healthy for those kids to buy in completely to these definitions of excellence. So we as there's a saying, we don't want to change the student to match the test. How can we change our educational system so it lifts up our students and reflects their culture and reflects their aspirations? It's a lot harder to do than it is to just say, why don't you go do that? But that's kind of the magnitude of the task we have.
Great. Yeah, actually, I think Posse Sahlberg said something like that, where he said, in America, we get the student prepared for the school, but in Finland, we prepare the school for the student. So let's go ahead and check out the next question from Ellie.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me here, and thank you to the amazing panelists. I'm very nerdy and have too many notes on what folks said, and I really appreciate being stimulated in that way. And so for folks that might not know, my name's Ellie Householder. I'm the school board president for the Antioch Unified School District. I'm the youngest person ever elected in Antioch, thanks in no small part to our revolution and their support in me. Whereas the charter schools were offering me tens of thousands of dollars, our revolution came and they're like, we'll knock on doors for you. And obviously it worked out for the better. So this is intersecting quite a few places for me. And so the one thing that I want to ask, and I want to ask all the panelists the same question, and Anthony, Mr. Cody, you kind of made me think of this like, well, it's not enough to just say these tests are racist. What are we going to do about it? And I'm a firm believer in what Angela Glover Blackwell calls radical imagination. And so in that spirit, I'm curious, if you had a magic wand, money's not an option, like there are no barriers or kind of parameters to implementing your idea, what's the one thing you would do for public education that addresses either one of the things that you talked about or mentioned or anything else? Because there's a lot to unpack, but if you could do anything, what would that be?
Well, I would start by saying, I'd look at the work of Deborah Meyer with democratizing schools, thinking about, how you conceptualize what learning looks like, making learning visible, and create processes where that includes community members and reflects community values and elevates learning so that it's visible to the community. I think that goes a long way to building ownership of public schools by the community. So that would be my suggestion.
Jack had to go put his daughter to bed. I wish he was here because he actually has a side hustle. He runs a group in Massachusetts that's devoted to coming up with a measure of school performance that more accurately reflects what teachers, students, and the community care about. And so, because I do feel like that is such a big part of our problem, that we're stuck in this framework and that it makes everybody unhappy. And so, what if there was a way for Oakland to define what it cares about and what what does it mean to be a successful school and a successful student? And so that I would really hold that up. I'm going to put a plug for his book, A Better Measure, in the chat, because I do feel like one of the problems we have, it's so cool to hear about progressives being elected to school boards, and then I interview them for my writing on my podcast, and I hear their frustration that they come in and the goal is to really like shake things up, and they realize they're stuck within this kind of like ancient framework, not just about test scores, but about like what it is a school board does. And so what if we could be a little bit bolder and bigger about the kinds of demands we were making, and what you guys like? Wouldn't that make your jobs more exciting, Mike and Ellie?
Well, mine's pretty exciting. So I kind of came in with a plan, I think. So I would say, it really matters what the specific issues in Antioch are right now. For us in Oakland, our real issue has been instability. So just to bring some stability and some continuity to our school sites and to our district is a really, really big thing after 20 years of this coming at us. I also, in California, we have good laws about school site councils. I'm also a big believer in fully empowering school site councils to make these school site decisions. Another thing we did this year is we put in a waiver to asking for a waiver from the state for Prop 39 offers. So this year we had no Prop 39 offers. We gave no new leases to charter schools under Prop 39. So I think there's a whole lot we could. So remember, Oakland and Antioch are not that far away. Let's talk sometime. But I think there is now a wave of new elected school board members across California. And I am, this is kind of out of this topic, but I'm a real believer in that we've had failed leadership across the board for 20 years, especially here in Oakland, elected officials, union leadership, and the nonprofit sector. I really believe that it's going to take a natural turnover in leadership before we can really bring some of these solutions forward. So I think now's the time for some of us newly elected folks to have a new path going forward. So I would say, in Antioch, you guys can propose whatever you want to propose as a school board. And when it comes to testing and evaluations, as long as you're not setting yourselves up to get dinged from the state or the feds, you have a lot of leeway in what you actually set up locally. That's why education's great also, where it is one of the things where we do have local decision-making power if we choose to really implement it.
Awesome. Did you have follow-up, Ellie, or?
No, just thank you all. I guess I actually did want to say too, another reason why this is actually super interesting for me is I think I might be the person on the call who's maybe the closest to having graduated high school. And so as a child of No Child Left Behind, I'm a product of those failed policies. And so these conversations give me hope, but I do just want to say, there are kids who are in school right now, just always keeping that as the frame. So thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, definitely, we have to always keep the next generation in our mind when we're dealing with all these legislation, which I wish the previous generation would have done, but c'est la vie. So the next question is going to come from one of our board members, Stephen.
Steve or Coach is good, Jake. Yeah, Mom calls me Stephen once in a while. And my students call me Coach Finch. You guys call me Finch, whatever it is. Mike, I had goosebumps. So I was an investigative journalist, mostly in the health and medical field for about 15 years before I became a teacher. Did my credential program at night while I taught at Cole Middle School, right between Lower Bottoms and Acorn. School had no sports program, no newspaper, had just eliminated its art and music program so they could have double math and double English. So they took what was engaging to a kinesthetic, artistic, culturally relevant education and dumped it out the window to try to hit this. And so what I'm hearing, what has been wonderful to me is hear about this paradigm shift in the way we think and the gatekeeping for what is success to get into school or to continue your career, continue your academics or your learning. I would say learning in the way that is right and how you want to do it. I will say this, for me, on-site councils, and I've been involved with other things and seeing, how much you guys are aware of how much there are pools of money that are earmarked. And to have this opportunity also got really pricked my ears up because we had 40-foot cyclone fencing. It looked and felt like a prison. They would lock the doors when I was outside. I got my PE credential to be out there. We had a football and a couple of hula hoops. That was other than the stuff that I would buy for every unit. But I will say this, right now as an itinerant adapted PE teacher in special education, I'm at 15 school sites around Contra Costa County, Antioch, at Turner, I'm out in Oakley, I'm all out that area, and I'm all the way out through the privileged schools, Rendell, Lafayette, and Walnut Creek. And the difference I see in where it's maybe an opportunity, every time I got to school, I said, we don't want to come to this school, Coach, it's Bootsy, right? I was in the age of hyphy my first year in Bootsy, and that was what our facilities were, and they really were shoddy. You didn't have to pay me. We had dedicated teachers. You have to pay me more, but you might provide a printer that worked. You might not make me have to buy my own printer ink and my own paper. That facility, that school site would be someplace that I was proud to come to. Now I'm a middle school kid. I'm not going to admit that I like my school, right? But something that is not falling down, something where it's not too hot in my class, where my Maslow needs are met at my school as a place where I've got a place to learn. It'd be great, whatever the recipe we come up to develop what we value is to develop critical thinking skills, culturally relevant education, and esteem around wanting to learn, like lifelong learners, right? We can teach you an individual piece of knowledge or skill, and we're going to need to do that so you can build on the stuff that's going to be asked of you later on if you want to go to college and other things as well too. But to build these lifelong learners, and without the engagement, the initial engagement of walking through that gate and feeling like this is a place I want to be. So I'm going to throw it out there that right now, and as a health and medical journalist and someone doing this master's program around the reopening of schools and COVID right now, there's social equity issues around crumbling infrastructure. It's all about airflow in those classrooms. Now you try to show 30 students 3 feet away from each other in a classroom where I might shut the door now because I'm more worried about students eloping or safety or security. I might have windows that are fixed and not opening, or it's too cold or too hot to arrange that. Now I'm going to expose those students to each other's, to the potential more viral load because of this as well. So that's staff and students being another equity issue. That's facilities. So these facilities where theoretically Oakland, I mean, it's butts and seats. That's how we're supposed to pay for our schools, right? You got more students, you should have more money. And it doesn't, like, even when you should have that, Lamar's talking about, you should have it, you don't quite get it. So my thoughts, and is for anybody who wants to jump on it, is that we can envision all these other things, but where we can hit locally is we can create school sites that are places, environments that are conducive to learning and teaching, where a teacher has the resources they need to creatively provide a great education and create critical thinkers, and where students don't feel, unsafe and disheartened just by being on the campus. I'm not sure that's a question, but my question is, my specific question would be to anyone. So I've got, how do we, maybe, and right now in facilities, I'm really concerned about people going back to school in some of our older schools and our more crumbly schools that where CDC and WHO will tell you that it's possible for us to go back safely. It's possible. But then they'll give you all these airflow studies that you're supposed to be measuring and monitoring with HEPA filters to make sure. Now, I know my county folks are working really hard to ventilate as much as possible, but in the marginalized communities, it's going to be worse, right? It's going to be that way. And so we're going to have all these little asymptomatic carriers, again, passing their exposure to this pandemic, again, more frequently in marginalized communities to their families and the other areas. So this is a big deal around facilities as well. What do we do about that? That's a sort of an immediate concern. And a longer picture, if they got this money, Mike, and it's not earmarked. Ooh.
Well, I want to jump in. So as a side note, Cole Middle School is closed and has been closed for over a decade. And, in that part of Oakland and West Oakland there has been one of the neighborhoods very impacted by these outside forces coming in. And so Cole has never been our prettiest school, at least during my lifetime, but it reached a point where it was being done intentionally. Our schools were intentionally being kept in a state of disrepair to make it easier to close them, to move those properties to developers and charter schools. That's what the end game always was in Oakland, was the properties. That was the real profit that folks were looking for. So I really think that this was intentionally done. I agree with you. I have been pitching a plan for next year, a recovery year, to throw $40 million out of these one-time relief dollars, put a coat of paint on it, make sure we have extra adults, and make our facilities look the way that they need to look. I really believe that a lot of that is just will and intention to make that happen. Now, I'm going to dodge the whole COVID reopening because it's a mess and we're in this pandemic, and we do need to be able to provide in-person instruction, but I'm really, really worried on how we get from where we are right now with our schools being shut down for over a year to being able to provide it in a real way in the fall. But we do have these one-time dollars to be able to do it. And in Oakland, we have a facilities bond now of almost $800 million. So we're actually looking at $1 billion extra dollars to be able to fund these things. And for our facilities, it has been looked into. The problem is about 30% of our facilities are older and can't accommodate the MERV 16 filters. And so this is going to be some open questions. And Oakland, so here's the other thing, and then I'm going to mute again. The one good thing about these one-time dollars is these one-time dollars are being targeted. And so this could be looked at as equity dollars. So for Oakland, we are getting over 10 times as much relief dollars per student as Piedmont, the city we surround with a lot of privilege. And so we actually have, for the first time, a competitive advantage it's almost like these dollars are the full funding of Title I and IDEA that should have always happened. And so certain districts, Oakland, Richmond, I'm sure even Antioch, are getting more dollars than other cities are. So we should use these dollars and have a targeted plan to spend these dollars to fund equity, since that's why we're receiving these dollars. And then the cautionary side is we just don't have these things in place in our districts. And to bring this back to privatization, charter schools have been able to get money directly through the small business loans and all of these other dollars. So even though charter schools are getting relief dollars directly, there is still an effort from privatizers to also tap into these dollars that we're getting in our public education system. So we also need to be on guard that they're not able to siphon off any of our dollars, or as few dollars as we can possibly allow.
Thank you. And then I will say my thing out there by you and Ellie and Lamar is Pittsburgh High. I know a lot of educators there, and there's just a different vibe. Now, they've had their problems, but that's been staffing and administrative and principals and other things, and their issues that are ongoing. But the site is dynamic, and there's just a different feel to the way those students just walk down the hallway, and that lights people up. And I see learning, and I really feel it there. So, and even if you can't make a brand new school everywhere, but like Mike, coat of paint, the resources and facilities that you need to print paper and have access to environmentally right temperature, like that's really high on the Maslow needs, right? Whether you're warm or cold or hot, those are some really simple things. So I really appreciate it, and again, super inspiring. I look forward to tracking what's going on in Oakland with you.
Awesome, thanks y'all. So anyone else have any other questions? Otherwise, we'll start going over to the audience questions real quick. All right, so here's the first one. Why are we including moderate to profound mentally handicapped individuals in the grade level standards testing? I mean, from my point of view, that's easy, so that we can fail the school and then create a charter school on top of it. That's basically it, follow the money. But I'll go ahead, and since I'm not the speaker, I'll let the experts talk. Anthony or Jennifer or Mike.
Well, I think part of the dilemma is there's been this idea if it's not tested, then it won't get attention, and so it's almost like, I mean, I think some of us would see these tests as really being profoundly cruel to some of the students, especially if they're dealing with whatever developmental issues they might have. But advocates have used this idea that the students are somehow being neglected if they're not tested. So that's, I think, partly why they get tested. I don't think it's a legitimate reason, but I don't know if other speakers might comment on that.
And anybody else want to answer that? Mike, where you are? They probably dropped off, or no, they're still here. Okay. Oh yeah, thanks Gayle, and thanks Jack for all your wonderful knowledge and the great questions, Gayle. All right, let's go ahead and just jump to the next question and just keep going. The rhetoric against school choice and hence agency of Black and Latinx families, particularly in urban environments that attend charter schools, appears problematic, particularly when this agenda is driven by white liberal progressives. How do you as historians of public education reconcile this tension?
So, this is a huge thing, and we talk about it in the book, obviously, but it's something that I think about a lot. And because so often the wars that we're seeing play out in communities like Oakland pit particularly teachers against, parents of color. And so as a group like Our Revolution, like you have to figure out how do you engage with this from a sort of political standpoint. And so I think that I would come back to what I raised earlier, which is, like, what are the demands being made? And what is it that people really want? And so often as you go from city to city, you'll see that what's on offer from the groups that are bankrolling a lot of this is way smaller than what people on the ground actually want. And then the other part of this is that as we transition now from charter schools, which is, like this has been the thing in Oakland, but now, like you go to Florida, right? And the end game is starting to come into view, and it's not charter schools. The end game is not just vouchers, but giving money directly to parents so that they can purchase any education product that they want and that they can be heavily advertised to. Right? And so, like, that you would take parents out of a public system and move them into an unregulated marketplace. So then, like, my question would be like, well, why is it that in order to exercise their choice that parents have to give up all their rights? Why is that? And so these are like, choice sounds good, but there's a lot of fine print and there are a lot of strings, and we have to figure out a way to talk about that makes sense but is also not condescending, right? And I think this gets back to what Lamar was talking about, that if you come to this conversation basically saying that there's all we're going to do is criticize the solution that's being offered but not acknowledge the incredible disparities, like that's a loser argument. So I'd be curious about, Mike, I imagine that you're having these conversations all the time. So how do you talk to parents who feel very passionately that having a better choice is, that makes a lot of sense to them? How do you tell them that we have to change the way we think about this?
Years and years of practice. And so this is one of the things that Journey for Justice nationally has just done a lot of work around. And so we had, for example, nationally, our We Choose campaign, where we were trying to directly counter those narratives. And so the campaign was, we choose educational justice, not the illusion of school choice. And, for my campaign, my campaign slogan was quality public schools in every neighborhood. It's in Oakland. What's really happened is so many of our families attend charter schools because there are no other neighborhood schools. And it's because of proximity and poverty more than anything else. And we know that charter schools don't outperform public schools as a whole. And so, but the other thing is, I agree with parents who are looking for a better option for their families. And so I am very careful to never criticize a family or a student for making that choice. And I respect a family is always going to make the best choice or what they think is the best choice for their family. Now, I blame the system for forcing them to make that choice. I blame the school board in Oakland. That's why I ran for the school board, is to change these conditions to allow families to make different choices. And so I just try to be real careful. And about 3 years ago, I learned how to talk about charter schools in a different way. So I don't talk anymore about if charter schools are union or non-union. I don't even talk about whether they accept a high enough rate of special education students. I talk about those schools receive public dollars and they're privately managed. And I regularly talk to families about if a charter school opens up across the street from your house, there's no guarantee that you can attend that school. And we need to build a system that's going to serve the whole community. Those have been the things that have started to resonate. And really with Journey for Justice and with the NAACP and Movement for Black Lives, all endorsing these policy points. About 2 years, So really big thing in the history of this movement was the NAACP nationally endorsing a moratorium on school privatization, because from that point forward, no other group could claim school choice as a civil rights issue because we had the NAACP on board. And so over time, I don't think that has been a winning argument anymore, and I hear it less and less. And I really want to, while we're on the subject, groups like BATS and like NPE have learned how to do a really good job in partnering with community groups to avoid those optics. And I think sometimes we need to be explicit in that to not avoid those optics. And just the last little thing, I don't buy into this dynamic that people pitch where it is teachers unions against parents. And so I just reject that out of hand. So hopefully we don't even get into those arguments.
Awesome. All right, so let's go ahead and jump to the next question real quick. What is the difference between charter schools and the privatized choice market-based higher ed model where Pell grants can be used at various schools, private colleges, trade schools, community colleges? Anyone of y'all want to take that?
Anthony?
No, Jennifer or Jack, do you have a clear? I mean, I would say, charter schools are getting a direct line of public funding for each and every student that they have. So the Pell grants and so on are going to colleges, whether they're public or private, and paying for the fees or tuition associated with that. So it's indirect, whereas the charters are getting direct public funding. They're pulling from the same pots of money that the public schools are pulling from. So in that sense, it's kind of a zero-sum game, and the public schools are losing dollars that are going to these privately controlled charter schools. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but that's my best answer.
Yeah, that works. So we're actually 15 minutes over. So we're going to just we're not going to be able to get to all the questions, but we're going to take this one last one. And then there's one more comment that we should probably listen to real quick. As a parent on my school district's budget committee, the main issue is that these federal funds are one-time and therefore don't lend themselves well to any continuing programs. Anthony and Mike, your thoughts about that?
I want to throw in, this is a huge systemic problem in public ed. I worked, you're constantly, as someone who's trying to do creative things, they want you to use grant money to get something started. And then as soon as you get started, they cut off the grant money because they want to fund something else. And they say that you have to institutionalize it and you haven't been successful if you don't. So it's a real problem where the funding sources shift, and this is going to be a real challenge with all of this money that's both this infrastructure money and the COVID relief money, is that it's going to be temporary, and it's part of the institutional starving of a public institution, where the schools have been underfunded for so long and reliant on these programs, and it feeds into the whole philanthropy being able to leverage their dollars, their discretionary dollars, to steer the whole ship of public ed. But I'm sure Mike has some thoughts too.
Well, of course, we get told the same. I've been told that for 20 years that I've been paying attention. Oh, you can't use one-time dollars for that. I reject that. As a school board, we have fiduciary responsibility of our districts. This is where we need to be creative with our budgeting. So I am very determined, and we're allowed under these COVID relief dollars, we have about a 3-year window that's allowed to use this money. We need to be creative and spread it over those 3 years. I'm going to try to even spread it over 5 years. Stuff like we can buy, bad example, but food trucks right now. and get a fleet of new trucks now instead of deferring it over the next 4 years. And there's other ways that we can really deal with that. But here's how I'm looking at it in Oakland is we are going to try to use these one-time dollars to fund our 3-year strategic plan to bring transformational change. That gives me as a new school board member 3 years to reprioritize our yearly budget and weed out some of the wasteful spending and consultants. And I am hopeful that there is going to be a higher level of funding for education going forward. Like some of this money will be in place going forward. And between these added dollars and doing the internal work to reprioritize our budget, by the time we get to year 3 or year 4, we've achieved enough savings to continue funding whatever we decide to fund now through our transformational change. I think what we need to do is we need to have smart and creative people involved with budgeting for our school districts. They tell us every time, oh, year 3, there's going to be a $60 million hole. That never comes. And that's just not what happens. So I think this is another thing where we need to change the narrative, and especially as progressives, we need to say, we need to use these one-time dollars to maximize our resources going directly to the community. The days of austerity measures and building up a reserve are over. We are in a crisis, and that crisis requires that we spend our resources to our maximum where they will directly have that impact. And so I think that's what we need to do. And if we run out of money in 3 years, then we all collectively go back to the state or go to the federal government and we make that change happen. But I don't think we should hold back now for fear of year 3 or year 4. And that's kind of this narrative that they've gotten us trapped in, instead of us just saying, well, what do you mean we can't use the money for that? Let's use the money we have and we can make good decisions. We don't need somebody else telling us how to manage our resources.
Does the budget say it can only be used for 3 years? Like if you go 5 years, are they going to say, or can we just plan for a 10-year program?
It's more basic than that. And there's about 4 different batches of money, or 5 now, that have come down. And what usually what they say is this money needs to be budgeted by this time. And so we have basically, depending on which pot, 6 to 18 months to budget it, but it doesn't have to be spent until 3 years out. And then beyond that, you can get creative and juggle around the different funds to really extend this money out if you're smart about managing your money. But people, the professionals will always tell you, oh, you can't use one-time dollars for that, or, oh, you need to be careful using one-time dollars for that. And I think maybe we should be having a different way of doing business.
Yes, definitely. I'm definitely down for just saying, no, if they can do it, we can do it too. All right, so here's the last question / comment, and both of y'all's thoughts on this. To Mike Hutchinson, I'm a former charter parent and staff. Sending my son to charters wasn't a real choice. Things we didn't have in charters, students with disabilities, diversity, libraries, sports, arts, was hard. I'm disheartened that many families lack space for a nuanced discussion about what we really want to do for our kids. And I've seen charter leaders frame and tell parents what we think for too long. Your thoughts, both of y'all?
I mean, I feel like somebody teed me up with that one. So I agree. But I really think so here's the best way I can tell. When I first started realizing these things was when my schools were being closed in 2011, 2012. And in looking into why my schools were threatened with closure, it kind of led me down the rabbit hole of learning about privatization and what was being done to Oakland. I think just this parent asking this question really reflects the change that's been happening. In Oakland, because of our collective work, a lot more of the community knows about these issues. It's why I won my election, because being supported by charter schools and billionaires from across the country did not help my opponent where it had helped them in the past. And so I think we are starting to have these conversations. What's lacking right now, and what I'm hopeful we can put together with the new strategic plan in Oakland, is we don't have our affirmative plan to counter it. So I want to start reopening sustainable community schools in Oakland, especially in the neighborhoods that have seen school closures. This is a certain model of schools that's based on community vision and full wraparound services and extra resources. And I think that's the missing piece right now, where we've won the narrative and we've won the rhetorical fight, but we don't have our plan for school design and our quality schools in place yet to rally people around. And so I'm really hopeful. It's hard now because the pandemic messed up some of my plans for coming into office, but I'm really hopeful that as we start to reopen our schools in Oakland, the next step for our new school board and this energy is to have our affirmative plan for quality public schools in every neighborhood. And that's what will silence those charter leaders once and for all, is when we beat them at their own game by really providing those high quality schools that they claim to have.
And I would just add to that, I really appreciate Mike's sort of on the ground focus on creating viable alternatives. And I think that's really the core work that needs to be done. But I would mention also that the Network for Public Education has been doing a lot of digging into where public funds have been going and what charter schools have been doing with them. And also the whole for-profit nature of a large part of the charter industry, which is really helping drive the lobbying that keeps it alive in Congress and in the Biden administration. And so I would encourage folks, if you're interested in really exploring the what's happening below the surface of the charter schools movement, take a look at, there's been 3 or 4 reports that the Network of Public Education has done over the last couple of years, looking into charter fraud and abuse, charter school scandals, the whole for-profit, the last report that I mentioned, the whole for-profit nature of charters and this whole myth that charters are nonprofits. The whole structure is built to be sort of a shell that allows public monies to flow into a privately controlled, profitable enterprise. So that's something that isn't, that is really obscured by the way that charter schools have been marketed and the way that they're structured. So take a look at the Network for Public Education.org website, and you'll see some of that reporting on the national level.
Yeah, and we have those links on our website also for anyone that wants to check them out, ourrevolutioneastbay.org/townhalls, and you can see a list of the speakers and links to all their different organizations. Thanks to everyone. This was a great talk. I'm pretty sure we enlightened many people, and hopefully we'll get some more broadcast. We're going to try to broadcast this on community access television in the Bay Area and see what happens, and PBS, and see if they let us. But let's see what happens. So I'm going to quickly pull up the intro or the outro slide deck. Do you guys see the join us, Our Revolution East Bay?
Yeah.
All right, cool. So this is, thanks for everyone for coming to our town hall. Our Revolution East Bay is ourrevolutioneastbay.org. And you can email us at info@ourrevolutioneastbay.org. If you go to our website, you can find all our Facebook, Twitter, Instagram links. And Badass Teachers Association is badassteachers.org. And you can email Melissa at contact.betmanager@gmail.com. And if you go to our website, again, on our town halls page, we have the links to all the books and all the organizations for all the speakers here, plus their entire bios. And as you've seen, they're ridiculously good at what they do. And I want to thank all of them for coming out. And thank you all for streaming and watching at home.